March 19th. Praise is your access, your key into the presence of God. Myles Munroe. How do we approach God? How do we enter into His presence? The answer to both these questions is worship. Psalm 100 verse 4 says, "Enter His gates with thanksgiving and His courts with praise." The picture is of the temple where you first entered in through the gates and then you were in the courts. Further in were the holy place and the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was represented by the Ark of the Covenant. Thus, thanksgiving and praise, both elements of worship, were the way in which you approached God. Worship prepared your heart for God and invited His presence. We see a similar principle in the pattern of the Lord's Prayer. We say, "Hallowed be your name," before your kingdom come. That is, we approach God with worship before we begin our intercession. As we saw in previous devotions on prayer, praise brings us into God's presence and then we can present Him with our petitions. But in a very real sense, to approach God is to invite Him. Psalm 22 verse 3 tells us that God inhabits the praises of His people. How amazing to know that as we worship, God comes in our midst, in His awesome presence. Some versions translate this verse as God being enthroned on our praises. I love this picture, that as we worship, Jesus sets up His throne among us, and we find ourselves in His royal presence. Myles Munroe writes, "Praise is how you come to know God. Praise is God's dwelling place, His sphere of influence and authority in your life. In essence, God will show up if you praise Him in the midst of your darkest moments." Each of us is seeking more of God's presence. That is why we're doing these daily devotions. The key to God's presence is worship. Even if you're going through a tough time today, just worship. He is waiting to come to you with His sweet and powerful presence. Today's prayer: Lord, thank You for the gift of worship that gives me access to Your presence.